May 1863, a telegraph operator at Union headquarters in Washington received an unusual message from the front lines near Fredericksburg, Virginia. The message was brief, partially corrupted by atmospheric interference, but its content was unmistakable. Confederate General Thomas J. Jackson deceased from wounds. The operator, William Hayes, noted the time as 4:27 in the afternoon. According to military records, Hayes delayed delivery of this intelligence to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck by nearly 40 minutes. When questioned later about this delay, Hayes claimed he sought verification, believing the information to be potentially false or planted by Confederate sympathizers. The truth, as archived testimony would later reveal, was more complex. Hayes had witnessed firsthand the effect that battlefield intelligence regarding Stonewall Jackson had previously had on Union leadership. "I needed to be certain," Hayes later wrote in his personal journal, discovered in a Virginia historical archive in 1940. Some names carry weight beyond the men themselves. Throughout the spring of 1863, Union forces in Virginia had suffered a series of tactical and psychological defeats, culminating in the Battle of Chancellorsville. This engagement, fought between April 30th and May 6th, had resulted in a Confederate victory despite the Union's numerical superiority: 27,000 Confederate casualties versus 11,000 Union losses. Military historians have long considered Chancellorsville to be General Robert E. Lee's masterpiece of battlefield command, yet it was Jackson's flanking maneuver on May 2nd that had broken the Union lines and shattered their morale. Before the battle, Union General Joseph Hooker had boasted to President Lincoln that he had the finest army on the planet. After Jackson's surprise attack, Hooker ordered a retreat that many officers later described as unnecessary. What had changed was not the strategic situation, but Hooker's psychological state after facing Jackson's tactical brilliance. When the verified report of Jackson's death from pneumonia following his battle wounds finally reached General Halleck's desk, his first recorded action was not to inform the President or the War Department. Instead, according to his aide, Major Charles Thompson, Halleck ordered all maps of Northern Virginia laid out on his desk and spent 2 hours studying them in complete silence. Thompson's account, preserved in military archives, describes Halleck as uncharacteristically contemplative, repeatedly tracing the Rappahannock River with his finger. Only after this prolonged map study did Halleck summon a messenger to take the news to the White House. The original dispatch has never been found in White House records. President Lincoln received the news of Jackson's death while meeting with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to discuss the ongoing Vicksburg campaign in the Western Theater. According to Stanton's personal diary, found among his papers after his death in 1869, Lincoln's initial response was brief: "So falls a soldier." What followed, however, was more revealing. Lincoln reportedly cancelled all remaining appointments for the day and requested all available intelligence reports concerning Confederate troop movements in Virginia. A White House staff member, Thomas Keller, later recounted that the president spent that evening alone in his office, a single lamp burning until well past midnight. What Lincoln was reading or writing remains unknown. No official documents from that evening's session have ever been recovered from the National Archives. The reaction at Union Army headquarters was measured and controlled, at least officially. Dispatches sent to field commanders mentioned Jackson's death only as a point of intelligence, without commentary or strategic speculation. Yet behind this professional facade, a different reality was unfolding. According to the unpublished memoirs of Colonel James Parker, a staff officer at Union headquarters, an extraordinary meeting took place on the evening of May 19th. In attendance were several high-ranking officers, including Generals Hooker, Meade, and Reynolds. "The atmosphere," Parker wrote, "was unlike any staff meeting I had attended before or since. There was a sense of release, almost of exhilaration, tempered with a soldier's respect for a fallen enemy. General Meade suggested a toast to a worthy opponent, which was observed by all present. Parker's memoir, never published and kept in his family's possession until 1939, contradicts the official record, which indicates no such gathering occurred. The morning after news of Jackson's death reached Washington, General George Meade wrote a letter to his wife that was never sent. Found among his personal effects after the war, the letter reveals a perspective absent from his official communications. "The Confederacy has lost its right arm," Meade wrote. Lee's genius for strategy was always complemented by Jackson's tactical brilliance and his ferocious execution. I have faced both men's forces and can attest that Jackson's presence on a battlefield was worth 10,000 men. His absence will be felt as keenly as any artillery bombardment. The letter continues, "I do not celebrate any man's death, yet I cannot deny a sense of relief. The Army of the Potomac may now operate with one less shadow across its path." Meade crossed out this last sentence, but it remained legible in the original document. The letter was dated May 20, 1863. But envelope markings suggest it was written and rewritten over several days, as if Meade was struggling to articulate his complex response to Jackson's passing. Far from the formal chambers of Washington, the reaction among field officers was more immediate and unguarded. Captain Henry Wilson, serving with the 5th Corps near Falmouth, Virginia, kept a daily journal throughout the spring campaign of 1863. His entry for May 21st notes, "News confirmed of Stonewall's death. Reactions among the men varied. Some cheered openly, while others, particularly those who fought at Cedar Mountain or Second Bull Run, remained solemnly quiet." Colonel Abbott remarked that he'd rather face any 2 Confederate divisions than one led by Old Jack. When Major Lewis suggested we might now press our advantage, Abbott replied sharply, "Lee remains, and Lee is the Confederacy's brain. We've merely removed one of his weapons, not his ability to command." Wilson's journal, donated to the West Point Museum in 1910 by his grandson, provides one of the few contemporaneous accounts of officers' reactions unclouded by post-war reflection or censorship. The most revealing response may have come from General John Sedgwick, commander of the 6th Corps. Sedgwick had narrowly escaped disaster during the Chancellorsville campaign, when his corps was temporarily isolated from the main Union Army. According to his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Robert Walsh, upon hearing of Jackson's death, Sedgwick withdrew to his tent with a map of the Chancellorsville battlefield and his personal journal. Walsh, concerned after several hours passed, entered the tent to find Sedgwick meticulously reconstructing Jackson's flanking march of May 2nd with small markers. When Walsh inquired about this exercise, Sedgwick reportedly answered, "Understanding how Jackson thought might help us predict what Lee will do next. Jackson was unpredictable because he violated conventional military wisdom, yet somehow succeeded. That success emboldened Lee to take risks no sensible commander would consider. I need to understand if those tendencies died with Jackson or if Lee absorbed them." Walsh's account appears in a letter to his brother, dated June 8, 1863, discovered in a Baltimore attorney's office during a building renovation in 1935. Military archives contain no record of Sedgwick sharing these insights with Army headquarters. General Joseph Hooker, still in command of the Army of the Potomac despite the Chancellorsville defeat, maintained an official silence regarding Jackson's death. No mention appears in his correspondence with Washington or his orders to subordinate commanders. This silence is itself noteworthy, as Hooker was known for his expressive and sometimes boastful communication style. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mason, assigned to Hooker's staff, later testified to the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War that Hooker's behavior changed markedly in late May. "The general became uncharacteristically introspective," Mason stated. He spent hours studying reports of Jackson's Valley Campaign of '62, seemingly trying to understand the man who had outflanked him at Chancellorsville. Mason's testimony, given in 1864 after Hooker had been replaced, contradicts Hooker's own account, in which he claimed to have given Jackson's death little thought beyond its tactical implications. Military records indicate that in the weeks following the news of Jackson's death, Hooker ordered increased cavalry, reconnaissance, and emphasized improved intelligence gathering, tacit acknowledgement that the Confederate command remained dangerous despite Jackson's loss. As May turned to June in 1863, the strategic situation in Virginia began to shift. Confederate forces under Lee's command moved northward, beginning what would become the Gettysburg Campaign. The official position of Union leadership regarding Jackson's death coalesced around a narrative of opportunity. The Confederacy had lost an irreplaceable commander, creating vulnerability that should be exploited. Yet private correspondence tells a different story. In a letter to his brother dated June 11th, General Winfield Scott Hancock wrote, "The death of Jackson has created a curious paradox. Our senior leadership expresses relief and sees opportunity, while those of us who have faced him in battle harbor a strange unease. Lee without Jackson is like a chess player who has lost his queen, still dangerous, perhaps even more focused. I sense Lee will attempt something dramatic, perhaps to prove the Confederacy remains viable despite this loss." Hancock's prediction would prove prescient as Lee launched his invasion of Pennsylvania just days after this letter was written. General George Gordon Meade, who would soon replace Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac just days before the Battle of Gettysburg, maintained a journal throughout this period. His entry for June 20th, never published during his lifetime and discovered among family papers in 1922, reveals a commander still grappling with the shadow of Jackson's tactical genius even after his death. We face not merely Lee's army, but the specter of Jackson's methods. His aggressive flanking maneuvers and rapid marches have become embedded in the Confederate approach to warfare. I find myself anticipating Jackson-like movements even now, weeks after his passing. This psychological effect may be his most enduring legacy. He has trained us to look constantly over our shoulder, to doubt our deployments, to see phantom columns threatening our flanks. 3 days after writing this, Meade was appointed to command the Army of the Potomac as it moved to intercept Lee's invasion. The most enigmatic reaction to Jackson's death came from an unexpected source. Ulysses S. Grant, then engaged in the Vicksburg campaign far from the Virginia theater, received news of Jackson's death while planning siege operations in Mississippi. According to his aide, Colonel John Rawlins, Grant read the dispatch twice, then placed it in his coat pocket without comment. Later that evening, however, Rawlins observed Grant writing a lengthy document that was not included in official communications. This document, presumed lost for decades, was discovered in 1941 among Rawlins' personal papers, donated to a Chicago historical society by his descendants. It appears to be a tactical analysis of Jackson's major battles, with particular attention to the Valley Campaign of 1862. In the margins, Grant had written, "Understanding Jay's approach to inferior numbers and position. Potential application to current situation. What makes this document remarkable is not merely its existence, but its timing. Written while Grant was fully engaged in what would become his masterpiece of strategic warfare, the Vicksburg Campaign. That Grant would devote time to studying Jackson's tactics while conducting his own complex operations speaks to the respect Jackson commanded even from enemies operating hundreds of miles from his sphere of influence. The ripple effects of Jackson's absence first became clearly evident during the Gettysburg Campaign. Lee's operational plan, a bold invasion of Northern territory, was consistent with his aggressive strategic approach. The execution, however, lacked the precision and coordination that had characterized previous operations conducted with Jackson. General Alfred Pleasonton, commanding the Union cavalry during the campaign, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The Confederate approach to Gettysburg had Jackson's ambition, but not his meticulous preparation. Lee seemed to be reaching for something just beyond his grasp." This assessment, while colored by hindsight, aligns with contemporary Union intelligence reports that noted unusual delays and communication failures in the Confederate command structure during late June 1863. Major General John Reynolds, who would fall on the first day at Gettysburg, had written to his sister on June 28th, "We face a Confederate army that seems to have lost some of its synchronicity. Their movements remain dangerous, but lack the clockwork precision we had come to fear." Reynolds's letter, posted just 3 days before his death, represents one of the last professional assessments he would make. In the years following the Civil War, as veterans from both sides reflected on their experiences, the psychological impact of Jackson's death on Union commanders became a subject of increasing historical interest. General Joshua Chamberlain, in a speech delivered at the Gettysburg battlefield in 1888, observed, "The Army of the Potomac fought 2 Confederate armies, the one physically present across the field, and the ghost of Jackson's legacy that haunted our strategic thinking. Even in death, he achieved a form of victory by planting doubt in the minds of his adversaries." This perspective was echoed by other Union commanders in post-war writings. The weight of Jackson's absence proved as significant as his presence had been, a psychological factor that shaped Union decision-making throughout the critical summer of 1863 and beyond. Military intelligence from that period reveals another dimension to this story. According to reports compiled by the Bureau of Military Information, Union commanders continued to receive and investigate rumors of Jackson's survival for weeks after confirmed reports of his death. Colonel George Sharp, head of the Bureau, noted in a June 1863 assessment that at least 3 separate reports of Jackson commanding troops in the Shenandoah Valley have been investigated and disproven in the past week alone. This persistence of Jackson as a phantom threat underscores the psychological impact he had achieved. Even in death, the mere possibility of his presence affected Union planning and troop deployments. No other Confederate commander, not even Lee himself, generated this level of continued vigilance after confirmed reports of their demise. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1939, when the Virginia Historical Society acquired the personal papers of Dr. Hunter McGuire, Jackson's personal physician. Among these documents was a sealed envelope containing McGuire's private observations on Jackson's last days. According to McGuire's account, written in 1870 but never published, Jackson spoke frequently of military matters even in his delirium, focusing particularly on the psychological aspects of warfare. The general repeatedly emphasized that an army's greatest vulnerability was not its flanks, but its confidence, McGuire wrote. He seemed to take satisfaction in knowing that his reputation would continue to fight long after he could not. Whether Jackson actually held this strategic perspective or McGuire attributed it to him retrospectively remains a matter of historical debate. What is beyond dispute is the accuracy of the prediction. Jackson's ghost continued to march with the Army of Northern Virginia long after his body was laid to rest in Lexington. To this day, military historians debate whether the outcome at Gettysburg might have been different had Jackson lived to command his famous foot cavalry. What remains less examined, but perhaps more significant, is how Union commanders continued to defend against Jackson's tactics long after the man himself was gone. The shadow of a commander proved almost as influential as his physical presence, a testament to the psychological dimension of military leadership that transcends battlefield tactics or strategic doctrine. In the fog of war, Perception often matters more than reality. For the Union generals who had faced him, Jackson remained a presence to be reckoned with, a tactical ghost that no telegraph reporting his death could fully exorcise from their strategic calculations. The telegram operator William Hayes, who had hesitated to deliver news of Jackson's death, perhaps understood this reality better than most. In his journal's final entry regarding this incident, he wrote, "Some men are larger than life. Jackson may have been the rare commander who was larger than death as well." Until 1942, most historical accounts of this period relied on official military correspondence and post-war memoirs, sources inherently shaped by hindsight and institutional perspectives. The discovery of private journals, letters, and informal documents has gradually revealed a more nuanced understanding of how Jackson's death affected the psychological landscape of the conflict. The gap between public pronouncements and private reflections tells its own story about the nature of military leadership and the complex human realities behind the strategic decisions that shaped the course of the Civil War. Perhaps the most telling comment came from General William Tecumseh Sherman, who, upon hearing of Jackson's death while campaigning in the Western Theater, reportedly told his staff, "Gentlemen, we have lost our most worthy opponent." History will record his campaigns as textbook examples of how determination and audacity can overcome material disadvantage. I regret that I never had the opportunity to test my approaches against his. This statement, recorded by Sherman's aide-de-camp, Captain Lewis Thompson, reflects the professional respect that transcended the bitter divisions of the conflict, a recognition that in Jackson's passing, something significant had left the field of battle, something that extended beyond the man himself to touch the very nature of warfare in the American Civil War, May 63 to July 63. 2 months that changed the course of the American Civil War, the transition from Chancellorsville to Gettysburg, from Jackson's final victory to Lee's first major defeat. The connection between these events has been debated by military historians for generations. What remains less examined is how the psychological impact of Jackson's absence reverberated through Union command decisions during this critical period. The telegram announcing his death, delivered with reluctance and received with complex emotions, marked more than the passing of a formidable enemy. It signaled a shift in the psychological balance of the conflict, a moment when Union commanders began to realize that their most feared opponent had been not merely a man, but a capability that had fundamentally altered their approach to warfare. In Jackson's absence, they would gradually recalibrate their understanding of the Confederate threat, but the imprint of his tactical ghost would remain, influencing decisions and shaping perceptions long after medical reports confirmed his passing at Guinea Station, Virginia. General Thomas J. Jackson, deceased from wounds. Stop. The words themselves were simple. Their echo would prove enduring. The complexity of the Union command's reaction to Jackson's death is perhaps best illustrated by a remarkable document discovered in 1937 among the personal effects of General Henry Halleck. A small, leather-bound notebook, catalogued simply as Strategic Assessment Spring 1863, contained a meticulous analysis of Confederate command capabilities following Jackson's death. Unlike official assessments, which emphasized Confederate vulnerability, Halleck's private notes revealed deeper concerns. Lee, without Jackson, loses operational flexibility, but may gain strategic focus. The Confederate command structure simplifies, potentially increasing efficiency in decision execution. We face not a weakened opponent, but a transformed one. This private assessment stands in stark contrast to Halleck's official communications, which uniformly characterized Jackson's death as an unmitigated setback for Confederate forces. The contradiction between public confidence and private caution reflects the psychological complexity that Jackson's death introduced into Union strategic thinking. The impact on frontline morale presents another dimension of this historical moment. Captain Frederick Marsh, commanding a company in the 12th Corps, recorded in his regimental log that news of Jackson's death spread through Union encampments with surprising effect. The men received the intelligence with a curious mixture of elation and disbelief, Marsh wrote on May 22nd. Veterans who had faced Jackson's flanking attack at Chancellorsville 3 weeks prior refused to accept the report, claiming "Old Blue Light doesn't die that easy." Others celebrated openly, though senior officers quickly discouraged such displays as unbecoming. Marsh's account suggests that among common soldiers, Jackson had achieved an almost mythical status, a commander whose mortality seemed questionable even when officially confirmed. This perception extended beyond simple respect for an enemy's capabilities to something approaching superstition. Marsh noted that for weeks afterward, cavalry scouts continued to report Jackson sightings that triggered alarm until disproven. Military intelligence records from June 1863 confirm that at least 17 separate false reports of Jackson commanding troops required formal investigation, diverting intelligence resources during the critical build-up to Gettysburg. General Hooker's relief from command on June 28, 1863, just days before the Battle of Gettysburg, has traditionally been attributed to strategic disagreements with Lincoln and Halleck. However, correspondence between Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Major General Darius Couch suggests another factor. In a letter dated June 25th, Stanton wrote, "Concerns persist regarding Hooker's recovery from the psychological impact of Chancellorsville. His fixation on Jackson's methods has become counterproductive, leading to excessive caution when decisive action is required." This assessment aligns with observations from Hooker's staff officers, who noted his increasing preoccupation with securing his flanks against attacks that mirrored Jackson's Chancellorsville maneuver. Colonel James Wilson, serving on Hooker's staff, later testified to the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of War that the general appeared haunted by Jackson's ghost, positioning reserves to counter flanking movements even when intelligence indicated no such threat existed. Whether Jackson's tactical legacy directly contributed to Hooker's relief remains speculative, but contemporary accounts suggest it influenced perceptions of his fitness for command during the critical Gettysburg campaign. General George Meade's appointment to command the Army of the Potomac on June 28, 1863, brought a different perspective to Union leadership. Unlike Hooker, whose direct experience with Jackson's flanking attack at Chancellorsville had left a profound impression, Meade's corps had been positioned elsewhere during that battle. His approach to Jackson's absence appears more analytical and less emotionally charged. In the memorandum to his corps, commanders dated June 30th, Meade emphasized, "We face the Army of Northern Virginia, not merely its individual commanders. While the loss of General Jackson alters their command structure, we must prepare for the same level of aggressive action that has characterized previous encounters." This professional detachment may have contributed to Meade's effectiveness during the Gettysburg campaign, allowing him to respond to actual Confederate movements rather than anticipated repetitions of Jackson's tactics. Yet even Meade was not immune to Jackson's psychological shadow. His aide, Major Alexander Webb, later recounted that throughout the Gettysburg campaign, Meade repeatedly requested updated intelligence regarding Confederate right-wing movements, the position Jackson would traditionally have commanded. The most profound impact of Jackson's absence became evident during the Battle of Gettysburg itself. On July 1, 1863, as Confederate forces engaged Union cavalry and infantry north and west of the town, the tactical situation evolved rapidly. According to reports from Union signal officers, Confederate movements displayed unusual hesitation. Lieutenant James Norton, positioned on an observation point near Cemetery Hill, noted, Confederate columns advanced, then halted, then changed direction without apparent coordination. Nothing like the precision we witnessed at Chancellorsville. This observation aligns with post-war analyses suggesting that the Confederate command structure struggled to adapt to Jackson's absence during rapidly evolving tactical situations. General Richard Ewell, commanding what had been Jackson's Second Corps, failed to press advantages on the battle's first day, a hesitation many historians attribute to the absence of Jackson's characteristic aggressiveness. Colonel Thomas Rafferty, serving with the Union First Corps, wrote in his official report, "The enemy advanced with determination, but lacked the coordinated fury we had come to expect from Jackson's attacks. Their movements seemed disconnected from their overall strategy." This assessment, though tactical in nature, reflects the broader psychological impact of Jackson's absence. Union commanders found themselves facing an opponent that had lost not merely a general, but an operational approach that had defined Confederate effectiveness. The psychological dimension of Jackson's death extended beyond military calculations to shape political perceptions of the conflict. In a previously unpublished letter to Senator Charles Sumner, discovered among Sumner's papers in 1925, President Lincoln offered a nuanced assessment. The passing of General Jackson removes from the field a commander of rare determination and skill, yet we must not overestimate its impact. The rebellion persists through the will of its people, not merely the genius of its generals. This perspective reflects Lincoln's consistent focus on the broader political and social dimensions of the conflict. Nevertheless, cabinet meeting minutes from June 1863 indicate increased presidential interest in Confederate command dynamics following Jackson's death. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles recorded that Lincoln questioned military advisers at length regarding how Lee might adapt his approach in Jackson's absence. This presidential attention underscores how Jackson's death resonated beyond immediate military considerations to influence strategic thinking at the highest levels of Union leadership. The reverberations of Jackson's absence continued long after Gettysburg. General Philip Sheridan, who would later lead Union cavalry during the final campaigns in Virginia, commented in his post-war memoir, "Throughout 1864 and 65, we frequently discussed how different our campaigns might have been had Jackson survived. Even as we pressed the Confederacy toward its eventual defeat, the shadow of his potential presence influenced planning sessions and deployment decisions." This retrospective assessment aligns with contemporary military correspondence that reveals persistent references to Jackson-type maneuvers well into 1864, long after his death. Major General Gouverneur Warren, commanding the Fifth Corps during the Overland Campaign, wrote to his wife in May 1864, "We continue to secure our flanks against ghostly attacks from a commander 1 year in his grave." Such is the lasting power of military reputation. This psychological afterimage of Jackson's tactical approach represents perhaps his most enduring contribution to Civil War military history, the creation of a tactical presence that survived his physical death. The final piece of this historical mosaic emerged in 1943, when researchers at the National Archives discovered a previously uncatalogued collection of papers belonging to Alan Pinkerton, who had directed Union intelligence operations during the early years of the war. Among these documents was a remarkable memorandum dated June 15, 1863, addressed to Secretary of War Stanton. In it, Pinkerton proposed an extraordinary operation, the deliberate spreading of false intelligence suggesting Jackson had survived his wounds and was secretly directing Confederate operations from a hidden location. Such information, Pinkerton wrote, would likely cause significant disruption to Confederate communication security as they attempted to suppress what they would recognize as dangerous misinformation. The confusion created would provide valuable intelligence regarding their command structure following Jackson's actual death. Whether this operation was ever implemented remains unclear, as no approval or operational documents have been discovered. However, the mere proposal illustrates how Union leadership recognized and sought to exploit the psychological impact of Jackson's reputation even after his death. This historical examination reveals a dimension of Civil War military history that extends beyond battlefield tactics or strategic decisions. The death of Stonewall Jackson created a psychological inflection point that influenced Union command decisions, intelligence operations, and strategic assessments throughout the critical summer of 1863 and beyond. The gap between public pronouncements and private reflections, between official reports and personal correspondence, illuminates the complex human realities that shaped military decision-making during this pivotal period. Jackson achieved something rare in military history. His tactical approach created a psychological presence that survived his physical death, continuing to influence enemy calculations and operations long after medical reports confirmed his passing. In this sense, the telegraph operator William Hayes, who hesitated to deliver news of Jackson's death, perhaps understood something profound about the nature of military reputation and its enduring impact on the psychological landscape of warfare. As historians continue to uncover and analyze primary sources from this period, the full dimension of Jackson's psychological impact on Union command emerges with increasing clarity. Beyond the battles he fought and the victories he secured lies a more subtle legacy, the creation of a tactical ghost that marched with the Army of Northern Virginia long after the man himself was laid to rest. For Union generals who had faced him in battle and experienced the disruptive power of his flanking attacks and rapid marches, Jackson remained a presence to be reckoned with, even in death. Their words, written in private journals, letters to family members, and confidential assessments, reveal how deeply his tactical approach had penetrated their military thinking. In these personal reflections, uncensored by official requirements or post-war justifications, we find the true measure of Jackson's impact on his adversaries. Perhaps the most telling assessment came from General Winfield Scott Hancock, who would play a crucial role in repelling Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. In a letter to his brother written in August 1863, after the Gettysburg campaign had concluded, Hancock reflected, "History will record the campaigns and battles, the victories and defeats, but may miss the invisible influence of commanders whose very names altered the calculations of their opponents." In this respect, Jackson achieved something remarkable. He trained us to fear possibilities as much as actualities, to see threats in shadows, to prepare for the unexpected until it became our standard approach. Even in his absence, we fought against the tactics he had embedded in our expectations. This observation captures the essence of Jackson's psychological legacy, the creation of a tactical presence that transcended his physical existence to shape the mental landscape of warfare in the Eastern theater of the American Civil War. Major General John Sedgwick, who had studied Jackson's tactics with such intensity following news of his death, would later implement elements of Jackson's approach during his own operations in the 1864 Overland Campaign. In his final letter to his sister, written just days before his death at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Sedgwick noted with irony, "We have, perhaps unconsciously, absorbed lessons from our most formidable opponent. The rapid deployment, the emphasis on surprise, the willingness to divide forces when conventional wisdom counsels against it, all echo approaches Jackson pioneered. In defeating him, we have partly become him." This observation highlights perhaps the most profound aspect of Jackson's influence, the degree to which his tactical innovations eventually transcended the Confederate cause to shape American military thinking more broadly. The story of how Union generals responded to news of Stonewall Jackson's death thus extends beyond immediate reactions or strategic recalculations. It reveals how military leadership operates in the psychological dimension, where reputations and perceptions can exert influence equal to or greater than physical capabilities. In the fog of war, where uncertainty dominates decision-making, the shadow cast by a commander of Jackson's caliber continued to shape the strategic landscape long after medical reports confirmed his passing. That shadow, reflected in private journals, confidential assessments, and personal correspondence of Union commanders, offers a unique window into the human dimension of military leadership during the American Civil War. For nearly 3 months following Jackson's death, from mid-May through the Gettysburg Campaign in early July 1863, Union commanders continued to defend against an opponent who was no longer present on the battlefield, but remained very much alive in their tactical calculations. This persistent influence, documented in sources ranging from official intelligence reports to private reflections, represents Jackson's final victory, a triumph not of arms, but of psychological impact. Long after the physical man had died at Guinea Station, his tactical ghost continued to march with the Army of Northern Virginia, influencing Union deployments, altering command decisions, and shaping the psychological landscape of the conflict. General Thomas J. Jackson, deceased from wounds. Stop. The telegraph message that reached Washington on May 18, 1863, announced the end of a commander's life, but not the conclusion of his influence. In the complex intersection of military strategy and human psychology, Jackson achieved something few commanders in history have managed, a presence that survived his physical death to shape the mental landscape of warfare. For Union generals who had faced him in battle and experienced the disruptive power of his tactics, Jackson's ghost proved almost as formidable as the man himself had been. Their words, preserved in archives and personal papers, reveal how deeply his absence affected their calculations during the critical summer of 1863 and beyond. In these reflections, we find perhaps the true measure of Jackson's impact on his adversaries, not merely what they said when they learned of his death, but how they continued to fight against his tactical legacy long after he was gone. Military historians and psychologists alike have noted that warfare is conducted not merely on physical terrain, but in the mental landscape of commanders and troops. In this psychological dimension, Jackson established a presence that transcended his physical existence, creating a tactical ghost that Union commanders continued to confront long after medical reports confirmed his passing. This aspect of his military legacy, revealed through the private reflections and confidential assessments of his opponents, offers a unique perspective on the nature of command influence during the American Civil War. In the words of telegraph operator William Hayes, who hesitated to deliver news of Jackson's death, "Some men are larger than life. Jackson may have been the rare commander who was larger than death as well." The evidence preserved in archives and personal papers suggests Hayes understood something profound about the enduring impact of military reputation on the psychological landscape of warfare. Until today, military historians remain divided on how the Gettysburg Campaign and subsequent operations might have unfolded had Jackson survived his wounds. What remains beyond dispute is that his absence fundamentally altered the psychological dynamics of command on both sides of the conflict. The complex reactions of Union generals to news of his death, preserved in private journals and confidential correspondence, reveal a dimension of Civil War military history that extends beyond battlefield tactics or strategic decisions to illuminate the human realities that shape the course of the nation's most devastating conflict.